Right. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and bear with us with the mistake that I have made earlier for the wrong link. So it is my pleasure to introduce Nicolas Brunel. Nicolas is a professor in the departments of neurobiology and physics at Duke University. His research focuses on the mechanisms of learning and memory from the synapse to the network level using theoretical models of brain systems. So today he will tell us how to model information storage and retrieval in brain networks.
Well, thank you very much. So thanks to the organizers of this Math Bio seminar, so Ying, Thomas, and Jonathan. And I'm particularly happy to give a talk in front of a Brandeis audience because I spent a year at Brandeis a long time ago, in fact, in 1999, so more than 20 years ago now. And this was really a fantastic year for me. So at Brandeis, I really discovered a place where theorists and experimentalists were working in the same building, and they were really interacting on a daily basis. And that was completely new for me. I was coming from Paris, where at the time there were a few theorists that were scattered in physics or math departments, but that had essentially no interactions with experimentalists. So I really had a great time at Brandeis. I learned a lot. I think it had a great impact on my research, and I also made a lot of very good friends. So let's move to the talk. So the topic of the talk will be about models of information storage and retrieval in brain networks. And so the question of how information is stored. Sorry, I have to move something from my screen. The question of how information is stored in brain circuits is one of the most fundamental questions in neuroscience. And of course, it's an extremely challenging question because of the complexity of brain networks. However, decades of research in neuroscience have led to the idea that information is stored primarily in synaptic connectivity between neurons. So how can that work? So this idea is illustrated in the next few slides that represent schematically a network of neurons that receives external inputs that represent information about external stimuli that are presented to an animal. So here we have, for instance, a stimulus A that is presented and that activates a subset of neurons in the circuits that here indicated in red. And so the basic idea is that in turn, this activation of neurons lead to changes in synaptic connectivity between neurons. And shown here is an implementation of a classic plasticity rule called the Hebbian plasticity rule that stipulates that neurons that fire together will wire together. So here you see that the synaptic connections between these red neurons have been strengthened by their co-activation. And in turn, these changes in synaptic connectivity will lead to changes in the dynamics of the network. And in fact, this has been explored in many theoretical models, in particular in a class of models, the strengthening of the synaptic connections lead to the formation of new fixed point attractors of the dynamics of the network. So now, basically, the activity of these neurons can persist even in the absence of the stimulus that has triggered this activity in the first place. And so that leads to the possibility of this network maintaining information about external inputs in short-term memory. In addition, these networks can also perform something called pattern completion. So if you activate only a subset of neurons in this group, then these strengthened connections can lead to the activation of the whole of this whole pattern. And so basically you can retrieve the whole information that's stored in memory based on incomplete or noisy inputs. In addition, these a single network will not be limited to storing information about a single stimulus. You can have another stimulus presented to the network, leading to additional synaptic modifications. And eventually, you can think about synaptic connectivity in a network as being a superposition of traces that are left by external stimuli that have triggered activity in this network. So this scenario leads to many questions, and here are a list, non-exhaustive list of different questions. The first question is really at the level of single synapses. So this question is, what are exactly the rules that govern synaptic plasticity? How do synapses change based on the activity of pre- and post-synaptic neurons, but also on other factors that might influence plasticity? The second question is at the network level. So how do changes in synaptic connectivity affect network dynamics? And finally, there are also theoretical questions about storage capacity of networks. So how much information can you store in networks with a given architecture? So in this talk, I will address these three questions briefly in the context of specific models. All right, so this is the outline of the talk. The first part, I will describe how we've inferred synaptic plasticity rules from in vivo data. And then I will move to various implementations of plasticity rules in networks that either lead to attractor dynamics or to sequential activity. So let's start with the first part, which is about inferring plasticity rules from in vivo data. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me at any time during the talk. I'm happy to take any questions at any time. Okay, so a few years ago, while I was at the University of Chicago, started a project which was about trying to infer plasticity rules from in vivo data. And the basic idea of this project is quite simple. So suppose we come back to this simple cartoon of a network whose activity is triggered by a particular stimulus that here activates these red neurons. Now, if the activation of these red neurons leads to synaptic modifications, one would expect that the activity of these neurons will change progressively as this stimulus is presented repeatedly to this network. Okay, so as if you're when you're presenting this stimulus repeatedly, you're strengthening these synapses. With this particular learning rule, you would expect that with time, or in other words, with familiarity with this particular stimulus, the activity of neurons would become stronger and stronger, right? Just because they receive more synaptic inputs because of this strengthening in synaptic connectivity. And in fact, I will show you next experimental data that show indeed significant changes in neuronal activity with familiarity. And so the question we asked is, suppose that we only observe neuronal activity and importantly changes in activity with familiarity, then what can we say about the plasticity rule that led to these changes? So to do this, we use data recorded in awake monkeys, and this data was recorded in David Scheinberg's laboratory at Brown University. So in this experiment, so this is a classic experiment in awake behaving monkeys. So monkeys are sitting on a chair in front of a computer screen, and in that particular experiment, they presented lots of different images to the monkey during a particular session they used, and each day they would present a large number of novel images, 125 that the monkey had never seen before, and then also a large number of familiar images that the monkey had seen many, many times, hundreds or even thousands of times before that particular session. And they recorded neurons in an area called IT cortex, inferior temporal cortex, which is indicated here. So in fact, that's sometimes subdivided into different parts. And this area is the last stage of purely visual processing in cortex. So visual information, as you know, comes from the retina, then goes through the thalamus, then enters cortex in area V1, and then goes through a series of processing stages. And IT cortex is known as the place where long-term visual memories are stored. And we know this from, in particular, from lesion studies. People who have lesions in IT cortex will typically have visual recognition problems. And when you record the activity of neurons in IT cortex of monkeys, you can see neurons that are selective to different types of visual images. For example, people have discovered face neurons that respond preferentially to faces, but there are also neurons that respond to other types of visual stimuli, like maybe chairs, bottles, or tools, and so on and so forth. So this is here an example of the response of one particular neuron in IT cortex to one particular image. And you see here the spike trains for different trials where the image is shown at time t equals 0. And this is like the average firing rate that's computed by basically averaging over these different trials. And you can see that this particular neuron starts increasing its firing rate approximately 80 milliseconds after the image is presented, and these 80 milliseconds reflect basically the time it takes for the information to go from the retina to that particular structure. And then this particular neuron responds particularly vigorously to that particular image. Its firing rate goes to values that are above 100 spikes per second for that particular image. But that's typically neurons would respond strongly only to a very small fraction of the images that are presented to the animal. What in this particular project, where we focused on the initial response of neurons, so the average, we computed the average visual responses in an interval that's between 75 and 200 milliseconds after presentation of the stimulus. And so each neuron was characterized by its average visual responses in this interval for all these different stimuli. Okay, so for 250 different images. So what we did then was to look at the distribution of visual responses, and we can look at this distribution separately for novel and familiar stimuli. And here is an example IT neuron. So this is a single neuron. And for this particular neuron, we can plot a histogram of the visual responses to novel stimuli here in red and to familiar stimuli in blue. And what you can see when you plot these two histograms together is, so the first thing you see is that typically the familiar responses in average are lower than novel responses. In fact, it almost seems that the blue histogram is shifted to the left compared to the red histogram. And notice that here the rates are plotted in logarithmic scale. So that shows that these distributions are approximately log normal. And also that shows that basically the firing rates span a large range of firing rates from a few rates to almost 100 hertz, depending on the visual stimulus that's presented. So there are two main features of the that come out when you compare these two histograms. First, the mean responses are typically lower for familiar stimuli. The second is that when you look at the tails of the distribution, you see that the strongest responses typically are responses to familiar stimuli. Okay, and that's in fact, so this is just one neuron, but we see this in the majority, in particular the majority of so-called putative excitatory neurons. So the basic picture that comes out from this comparison is that the learning process that's operating in IT cortex, what it does is, starting from a broad distribution of firing rates for novel stimuli, it basically pushes the bulk of the distributions toward lower values, making the average response lower and lower with familiarity, while at the same time stretching the tail of the distribution, so that increasing the responses of a small fraction of neurons. So that's the picture that emerges from this data. Now the question is, what kind of plasticity rule can lead to this difference between the two? So to answer this question, we focused on essentially the simplest possible model in which you can study this question, which is a firing rate model. So in such models, which are quite popular in computational neuroscience, neurons are described by their firing rate, which is an analog variable. Ri of t is the rate of neuron I. And in one particular instantiation of these models, these rates obey a first order differential equation, where you see here a decay term, meaning that the rates will go to 0 if neurons receive no inputs. And then the inputs are given by the argument of this function phi. So IIX represent the external inputs to neuron I. And then this second term here, this sum, represents the recurrent synaptic inputs, so the inputs coming from other neurons in the networks. And these inputs are weighted by the synaptic connectivity matrix, Jij. And finally, this function phi that transforms inputs into rates is a so-called transfer function of Fi curve, and is typically taken to be a sigmoidal function, or sometimes also a rectified linear function or ReLU function. So how can we implement learning in this model? So what we did is the following. So first we have to describe how external stimuli are represented in this network. So how are the external inputs defined for novel stimuli? So what we did is very simple. We just drew randomly these external inputs IIX in such a way that the distribution of firing rates, the resulting distribution of firing rates, matches the empirical distribution of firing rates in the data. Okay, so and we have a simple way of doing this. In fact, what we did is we take IIX to be random Gaussian variables, and then we can choose the transfer function phi so that the distribution of rates will match the empirical distribution of rates. And in particular, if the argument of this function is a Gaussian, basically a supralinear function phi will produce a skewed distribution of firing rates that's basically with a suitable nonlinearity will match these distributions. In particular, if this was exactly a log normal, then phi should be an exponential function, basically, that would transform a Gaussian into a log normal. All right, so now we have basically a way of generating external inputs. So now, how are they learned? So the next step is to change the synaptic connectivity, and we can do this by specifying a plasticity rule. So, and the idea is that we'll be using an unsupervised plasticity rule in which the synaptic changes depend only on the rates of the postsynaptic neuron Ri and the presynaptic neuron Rj. And now the question, so first, what we can do after we change the connectivity, what we can do is now we can compute the distribution of visual responses after learning, which is now we can present again the same external stimulus, and now we can compute the rates, the responses of neurons to that stimulus, which is now familiar. And so we get a new distribution of firing rates for familiar stimuli. And now our goal is to find the plasticity rule or the plasticity rules that such that the distribution in the model will match the one in the data. All right, so now to cut a very long story short, what we found is that these the differences between these two distributions are consistent with the Hebbian plasticity rule, in which synaptic changes are proportional to the product of a function, an increasing function of the postsynaptic firing rate times an increasing function of the presynaptic firing rates Rj. Okay, and we found a procedure to infer, in particular, the function f, which is shown here for this particular neuron, we find that the functions f are well described by sigmoidal functions, so sigmoidal dependence on the postsynaptic firing rate, which is negative for low rates and positive for high rates. And so to connect this function with the changes in distributions here, let's first look at the negative part of this function. So the negative part of this function for rates that are below a particular threshold, which is about 30 spikes per second for this neuron, this is the part that's responsible for the decrease of rates for most of the distribution. So the bulk of distribution is going down, and this is a product of this negative part here in this function f. On the other hand, the stretching of the tail here is due to the fact that for high enough rates, this function f is positive. So that means that basically, in average, the synaptic weights onto that neuron, the total synaptic inputs to this particular neuron will go up when its firing rate is above this particular threshold of 30 Hz. So essentially, what we infer here is a Hebbian rule that has a strongly nonlinear dependence on firing rates, in particular on the postsynaptic firing rate, and also that has a high threshold for potentiation. Basically, to get a potentiation of responses, we need the firing rates to be above this threshold, which is only reached for a small fraction of the stimuli. And in fact, what we showed is that this plasticity rule will lead to a sparsening of representations with learning. Because essentially what this plasticity rule is doing is enhancing the rates of only a small fraction of neurons, but at the same time decreasing the rates of most of all the others. All right, so the next question then was then what kind of dynamics have networks with such learning rules? So we have a learning rule that's inferred from data now. We can and we can now investigate how this will affect the dynamics of the network. So let's write again the equations of the model. So we have this simple firing rate model, which is described by this equation. Now let's explain now how the connectivity matrix is built. So we can build, so we can store a number of memories in this model by generating random patterns, which are generating according to Gaussian distribution. So for each pattern and each neuron, we have basically an input psi I mu that is drawn according to a Gaussian distribution with zero mean and unit variance. Then we can build the connectivity matrix by basically adding by a linear superposition of modifications that are induced by each of these patterns. And to do this, we take this input psi I mu, then we pass it through this transfer function to generate a firing rate. So that's indicated here. Phi of x is the firing rate when this pattern is presented. And then it's passed through these additional nonlinearities f and g. And then the product of these two functions basically is what modifies the connectivity matrix. In this model, we do this learning process on top of a sparse connectivity matrix. So here Cij is a connectivity matrix where Cij is equal 1 with a low connection probability C, and it's 0 otherwise. And there are two reasons why we do this. First, networks, real networks in the brain are not fully connected. Connectivity is connection probabilities are typically low, of order maybe 10% for nearby neurons in cortex. And also there is another reason is that basically that's taking the sparse limit simplifies greatly calculations in this model that I will show briefly. Okay, so then what we can do is we can do both numerical simulations of the model, and then we can also do a mean field analysis that I will describe briefly. So let's start with some numerical simulations. So with simulations, we can show that if the number of patterns that's stored in the network is not too large, then the network will have will be multi-stable, so it will have attractor dynamics, which is in fact qualitatively similar to a number of associative memory models that have been introduced in the literature. In particular, the Hopfield model is perhaps the most famous of these models. So you could represent this, the space of states of the network in the following way. So you have here, this is a background state that's uncorrelated with all the stored patterns. But then you have also other attractor states that are correlated with the patterns that are stored in memory.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
So you mentioned there are some Gaussian distribution for your memory pattern. So what happens if it is not Gaussian without this assumption? It's like some more structure in the network, then how that will change your learning?
Right. So there are, okay. So here, what you're saying, what if it's not Gaussian? Yeah. So we haven't really, in this particular work, we haven't really explored other distributions, because the idea was we wanted to constrain the patterns so that they give rise to the distribution of firing rates that match the data. Of course, here the choice of a Gaussian is just a convenient way of doing this, because we are basically, we assume the inputs are Gaussian, and then we constrain this function phi so that the distribution of phi of x matches the data. Okay, and it turns out that the resulting function phi we find is basically very reasonable and matches what we would expect from lots of other studies. For instance, it's strongly supralinear in a large number of rates, which is consistent with what we know about how neurons behave in cortex. So of course, now we could also relax this assumption and then generate patterns that have different distributions. In fact, if phi, so there is one other case that has been studied extensively in the literature, is the case of binary patterns. So this is the case of the Hopfield model and many variants. In fact, most associative memory models have used binary patterns, right? But we haven't explored systematically other choices, but that could potentially be a potential future direction to see how the distribution of rates affects the properties of this class of models.
Can I ask a related question somewhat? I would have thought that your rule that you found was Hebbian for the change in JIJ would actually depend on what the initial set of JIJ was. For example, if you had a strongly inhibition stabilized network, which there's a lot of evidence for in cortex, then you could imagine you're actually just increasing strengths of connections, but that causes the decrease in firing rate for a large number of cells. So you don't actually have to decrease some of those connections. So I forget, what was your initial assumption for the JIJ beforehand? Did you include specific inhibitory neurons?
Yes, very good question. So here I'm really, I mean, for the lack of time, I didn't want to go into the distinctions between excitation and inhibition. And so here basically, okay, so there are several answers to this question. So when we infer the plasticity rule, we really did take into account that there is separate excitation and inhibition. And in fact, we find that the data is consistent with different, that this Hebbian rule is only present in excitatory neurons and not in inhibitory neurons. Because in inhibitory neurons, in particular, we find no evidence that there is this stretching of the tail of the distribution. Okay. So that's one thing. So now what you're saying about this effect being due to the so what you were saying, if I understand correctly, is like, what if this decrease is due to an increase of inhibition? Okay. So the question then is, would that increase in inhibition come? We haven't so in the simplest model that we studied, this you need to have a function f that has a negative average in order for this to happen. Though we didn't fully explore the space of strength of excitatory and inhibitory weights. So I think you're raising an interesting possibility that even with for example, with a balanced f, this could happen with increase in inhibition, which we haven't really fully explored. Now, to clarify, to come back to the dynamics question. Now here, for simplicity, I'm telling you only about a network that no longer has a distinction between excitation and inhibition for simplicity, okay? And I'll come back at the end about networks with separate excitation and inhibition at the very end. We can implement these networks also with separate excitation and inhibition. But yeah, thanks for raising this issue of excitation and inhibition. Okay, right. So basically, this is a simulation of this network where you see that this is an illustration of the network where we're starting from this baseline state, and these are firing rates of I think was about 100 different neurons, and you see that there is heterogeneity in firing rates in the baseline state, as you see in cortex. Then we are presenting one of the stimuli, and presentation of the stimuli means basically having an increase, basically adding these additional inputs, IIX, basically IIX that are equal to the values for this particular pattern, which leads to this broad distribution of firing rates. And then what happens is that after the stimulus disappears, the network basically relaxes into one of these attractor states, the ones that correlated with the presenting pattern. And what you see a manifestation of this, the network being an attractor state, is that these neurons here are basically have a persistent elevated firing rate. And this is something that in fact has been observed in IT cortex in monkeys, especially in tasks, in shorter memory tasks, such as that, for example, the delay match to sample task. And in particular, what this network gives is automatically you have only a small fraction of neurons that will have elevated delay activity, which is consistent with what people see in the data, where only a low fraction of neurons will be highly active after a particular image is presented. All right. So very briefly, the fact that we use this sparse connectivity matrix allows us to perform mean field calculations. So even though, in fact, the connectivity matrix is not symmetric, and the idea is that in the sparse connectivity matrix, so you have basically the inputs to neurons become Gaussian in the large n limit, and these different Gaussian the Gaussian terms in different neurons become uncorrelated in that limit, and that allows you to solve the equations. So to do this, you need to define some order parameters. In particular, we have an order parameter M that characterizes the overlap of the network states. Here, Ri is the firing rate of neuron I with one particular pattern that is currently retrieved by the network. So here, pattern number 1, say. You have another order parameters which is proportional to the average of the square rates in the network, and that order parameter describes the noise due to other patterns that are stored in the connectivity matrix. So here you have a sum over all other patterns that are stored in the connectivity matrix. And eventually, taking the proper limits, basically these order parameters will be given by these equations, which are essentially here the right-hand sides are given by Gaussian integrals. Xi is the Gaussian variables describing the state of the neuron in the particular pattern. So this Gaussian variable that I introduced earlier. And Z describes this noise term, which is due to the interference caused by other patterns that are stored in the network. importantly, in this equation, you have here this parameter alpha, which is the ratio of the number of patterns that's stored in the network divided by C times N. C is the connection probability, N is the number of neurons. So this is the, in other words, this is the average degree, so the mean number of connections per neuron. And so when we can solve these equations numerically, and the idea is that this network will have so-called retrieval states, so stable states that are correlated with patterns that are stored in the connectivity matrix when we have solutions where M is non-zero. Okay, and then we can also compute the storage capacity in these models by finding the largest value of this parameter alpha for which these retrieval states exist. And in particular for this network, we can plot so the overlap M as a function of this parameter alpha, which we call memory load. So again, this is the number of stored patterns divided by the average degree. And this is the result of the mean field calculations. And here we have comparison with numerical simulations of networks of 50,000 neurons. And interestingly, when we take parameters that are inferred from data, we find that this memory load alpha is about 0.6. And interestingly, this is in fact of the same order of magnitude that other models have found. For instance, let's say the Hopfield model, for example, has a maximal capacity which is 0.14. So this model will have a higher capacity than the Hopfield model. This is not surprising, in fact, because we know that both sparse connectivity, but also sparse coding are two factors that enhance capacity. So this is known from previous studies. And here we do have a model that has sparse connectivity, and we also have a model that in which patterns are sparse. You have only a small fraction of neurons that are strongly active in a particular pattern. So that is not surprising, in fact. So we also asked the question of what learning rule would maximize storage capacity. In fact, what we can do is we can try to find what are the functions f and g that leads to the highest possible storage capacity. And interestingly, what we found is that the optimal rule is one in which both f and g are step functions with high thresholds. And in fact, with this particular choice, what happens then is that the plasticity rule with such functions will binarize the input patterns. So you have input patterns that are initially continuous, but then they are binarized by the plasticity rule before they are stored in the connectivity matrix. And the resulting connectivity matrix is nothing else than a well-known model, the Zodik's Feigenman model. Interestingly, the maximum capacity in this case is about 0.8, so it's not much higher than the ones we find for parameters inferred from data. And interestingly, so why is this number so close to the optimal value? Well, basically, we can see that this function f that we inferred from data is actually pretty close from being a step function. And it also has a really high threshold. So this suggests that this particular plasticity rule that we have inferred from data is actually well suited for having a large capacity, a network that has large capacity. Okay, so very briefly, we also explored the model beyond the parameters that were fixed by data. We found in particular that in this model, if we increase the coupling strength, so here we have a parameter A that multiplies this whole connectivity matrix. So A can be inferred from data too, but we can also change it. We can either decrease it or increase it. So basically vary essentially the coupling strength. And when we increase the coupling strength, we see that there is at some point a transition to chaos. And again, this is not very surprising. In fact, our model is quite similar to previous rate models with asymmetric connectivity. In fact, the first such model was the model by Chaim Sompolinsky and collaborators proposed in '88 that described quantitatively the transition to chaos in a purely random network. What's interesting here is that we have a chaotic network in which the retrieval states still exist in spite of the chaotic dynamics, but now they are in these retrieval states, they are chaotic. So here, this is another simulation where we're presenting a particular store pattern in the connectivity matrix. The network then goes to a chaotic state in which neurons fluctuate, but the statistics of their fluctuations here are different from the background state. And in particular, what we can see is that the network is fluctuating around a configuration that is strongly correlated with one of the store patterns. And so interestingly, this generates a very highly irregular dynamics, and that is reminiscent of some experiments, in particular in primary prefrontal cortex, where people have found a strong irregularity in this.
Nicola, can I ask?
Yes.
When you have smaller a, was it reaching a steady state then, so that eventually, even though the learning rule is still going, the JIJs aren't really changing statistically? Because I would have thought that you might always get to this chaos if you just kept going and going.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very good question. Actually, this is actually what I'm describing now is like with a fixed connectivity matrix. So like learning, it's like first doing the learning. I mean, separating the learning and the dynamics. Okay.
Okay. So the learning is just time limited. You're not reaching a steady state
exactly.
necessarily.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, and we're actually studying. So that's a very good question. We're studying now what happens when we are kind of an ongoing learning and things kind of become much more complicated as you would expect. But yeah, I don't have anything to show for that direction. So actually, we're talking about the changing this kind of learning gain, and this is kind of a phase diagram that what we can make. In fact, this is a phase diagram for a simpler model with binary patterns that was in fact introduced by Tirozzi and Sodix. But that illustrates our model, the one that's basically inferred from data, as qualitatively a similar phase diagram, except that it's harder to obtain. So this is still work in progress by Ulises Pereira, who did this work. But that illustrates basically these different types of these different phases in the network. So basically you have for a particular value of A, when you're increasing in particular, you're increasing the number of patterns that are stored in the connectivity matrix, you have first a phase where you have fixed point attractors. So the network converges to fixed point attractors. One particular is illustrated here. Some neurons have high rates, some neurons have low rates. Then there is this transition to chaos for each of these attractor states, where now the network fluctuates chaotically. And I don't have time to give more details about this, but if we have a model that has online learning now, so basically you're adjusting the weights continuously using this particular prescription, where now you need to have an asymptotically stable distribution of weights, you need to have a decay term here. Then what we see is that all the attractor states are no longer statistically equivalent. Now, basically, they depend on the age of the pattern. So how far in the past it's been seen. And interestingly, what we see here is that there is typically a transition as the pattern becomes older and older from fixed points to chaos. So basically, the older patterns at some point become chaotic before they destabilize. So the basic picture is that what we find is that so first, if we increase the coupling strength in a network with a fixed number of patterns, we see that at some point each of these attractors transition from being stable fixed points to chaotic states. And then in a model which has this online learning, what happens is that as patterns becomes older and older, they transition from from being stable fixed points to chaotic, and then more and more chaotic. And then, in fact, at some point, the dynamics of the network will be only transiently chaotic before they go to a more stable state, which is typically the most recently learned pattern. Okay, so let me let me go through a number of conclusions at this point. So I just showed you a network model that has a distribution of patterns and a learning rule that are both inferred from data, and I showed you that actually leads to attractor dynamics. And an interesting finding is that this learning rule that was inferred from data is actually close to optimal in terms of storage capacity. Of course, optimal here is optimal in a rather restrictive sense. We only looked in the space of Hebbian rules that have a sigmoidal, that are separable in the pre and post synaptic rates and have a sigmoidal dependence on both rates. And also what I showed is that we had a transition to chaos at sufficiently strong coupling, and that is potentially a way to explain the strong irregularity that people have seen in experiments in prefrontal cortex. Okay, so I think we are almost one. I was planning also to tell you about sequences, but I don't think I have time to go through that part. So I think it's probably a good time to stop. And by the way, I just want to mention the people who've contributed to this work, in particular about the inference of the learning rule. So this was done by Touboul Lim. She was a postdoc at University of Chicago, and now she has assistant professor position at NYU Shanghai. And we also collaborated with Yali Amit from the statistics department, and with David Scheinberg and David Friedman, who both gave us data recorded in IT Cortex about the part on attractor dynamics and also chaos. This was a work by a PhD student at University of Chicago, Ulises Pereira, who's now a postdoc at NYU, and with a contribution from Jonathan Al-Jadef. And I didn't have time to tell you about sequences, and in fact, the work on sequences was done by Max Gillette, another student that in fact did most of his work at Duke, and also work by Subhadra, who's now at Brandeis, and in fact she can tell you more about it if you ask her. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much for such a wonderful talk. So please feel free to ask Nicolas questions if you have any.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One of the questions I had regarding the model about inferring the learning rules was about the setup, the choice that you made to look at the plasticity between excitatory cells. So apparently you also did for inhibitory, but within the AIC. I was wondering if there is also evidence that there is plasticity with upstream areas, and is there kind of learning upstream before the information arrives into AIC? And
yeah, that's very good questions. So first question about excitatory versus inhibitory. Let me come back to these curves here. So, I mean, one nice thing with this procedure that we introduced is that we can generate these curves for all the recorded neurons in David Scheinberg's data set. And what we see is that qualitatively this shape, we observe it only for a subset of what they call putative excitatory neurons. So by putative excitatory neurons means that these are neurons that have broad spike width, and that's a way that people use to classify neurons depending on the shape of their extracellularly recorded waveform. On the other hand, for putative inhibitory neurons that have narrow spike width, what they find is that basically this would be like a flat curve. Essentially, there is no dependence on the postsynaptic firing rate, and this is flat and negative. And this is actually consistent with the model in which there is no plasticity in inhibitory neurons. And in fact, essentially in inhibitory neurons, what you see is that the distribution for familiar stimuli is essentially, you can think about it as being pushed towards the left, having the same shape as the novel one, but pushed toward the left. And this is consistent just with inhibitory neurons just reflecting what happens in the excitatory network. So if you have a drop in average firing rates in the excitatory network, then with unstructured connectivity from E to I, from excitatory to inhibitory neurons, you will have a drop in rates also in the inhibitory network. So that's kind of the simplest model. Of course, we are not, this certainly does not rule out other explanations. We just think it is the simplest model that accounts for the data. Now about other structures, so that's a very good, a very good question. We don't think that there is no plasticity in structures that are upstream. In fact, there is a recent paper showing that you have also a decrease in firing rates with familiarity in area V4 or V2. I don't remember now. I think it's V4. And so the question is whether these changes are inherited from these upstream areas. I would argue, though, that then potentially the learning that we're describing here in IT maybe is actually occurring in this earlier area. Also, a possibility would be that here we've only looked at synaptic plasticity in recurrent connections. We could also look at plasticity in feed-forward connections, and this is something that Surbin Lim has worked on after she left Chicago. So now that she's in Shanghai, so in particular, she wrote a paper in which she says that the claim is that you get a better description of the data, in particular the dynamics of the firing rate, which I didn't address here. So if you look at the dynamics of the response, you can fit it better with the model that has plasticity both in recurrent and feed-forward connections.
Thanks. I'm very interested in the multiple chaotic states that you found. So in principle, can you get, just with the increased connection strengths, a similar number of, I guess these are strange attractors that are set with separate matrices between them, so they're kind of confined in phase space that is similar to the maximum number of fixed points, at lower connection strength. So so you can really get, in principle, like hundreds of separated chaotic states.
Yes, we do, and that's kind of a little bit surprising. That was a little bit surprising to us that that in fact. So what happens in fact when you look at this phase diagram is that typically you have fixed points when you have a small number of memories, but then they become chaotic as you increase the number of memories. Because in this, basically, if you go up here,
right,
basically you have more and more memories. And that sounds a little bit counterintuitive because one would expect that you can fit less chaotic attractors than fixed point attractors in a network way. But that's actually the opposite that happens. In fact, there is something even more surprising, I think, here that really surprised us is that so you can compute the capacity in two ways. You can compute the capacity for fixed points, okay? So in the mean field equations, you can look at the static version of the mean field equations in which you don't take into account the chaotic fluctuations. And this is the line that we get for the capacity, that's this dashed line. Now, if you use dynamical mean field theory to account for the chaotic fluctuations, and this is similar to the Sompolinsky, Crisanti, Sommers work, then we actually get a higher capacity. So that's something that really puzzled us quite a bit. And we don't have really a simple explanation for that. That would think that the chaotic fluctuations would decrease the capacity because it would seem that you add noise in a way, but it's actually the opposite that happens.
Okay.
I also find this bifurcation diagram quite fascinating. I was wondering, so at the did you look around the transition, the red and blue transitions? What happens? Is it do you have all fixed points that become strange attractors, or is it kind of in a narrow region, or is it very progressive? I mean, around the transition 2 to 3, and then between 3 and 4, do you know what's going on with the attractors? I mean, strange attractors, they can disappear mathematically. I mean, when they collide with another structure like an invariant manifold. This is called a crisis in a strange attractor. So you imagine you have a strange attractor, and then one of the points starts touching like a separatrix, and then after this transition it opens, and then they mix together. And I'm wondering if you have evidence that this is what happens. And also when this happens, you have very long chaotic transient. So in fact, you live on the chaotic attractor, on the strange attractor, for exponentially long times as you cross the crisis. I don't know if you looked at what happens here and if you think this could be the...
Yeah, I think these are great questions, or in fact suggestions for us to look in more detail at these transitions. And unfortunately, Ulysses, I mean the student who did this work, is no longer, so he kind of left kind of a long time ago. In fact, we are kind of trying to finish this a paper on these results. It's kind of, we are almost like 2 or 3 years after he left. But yeah, these are really great questions that I wish I had more answers to. About your first point about how narrow is this region, if I remember correctly, this is actually quite narrow, in the sense that it seems that basically all the fixed, because all these patterns are statistically equivalent, right? So they are they all undergo this transition to chaos in a relatively narrow range of parameters. Of course, this is not really in the case where you have this. Let me go to this picture directly here. What you see here when you have this model with in which memories are no longer statistically equivalent because they are characterized by their age. So their more recent memories are bigger basins of attraction. Then what happens is that basically you have, when you're adding more patterns to this network, so you're adding you're adding this new pattern that has a big basin of attraction. So it means that you're pushing one older pattern into the chaotic regime. So they are basically pushed one by one into in the chaotic state.
It's really fascinating.
I guess just think of a memory readout kind of need. Are these chaotic attractors linearly separable in some sense, that you can put planes between them, do you think?
Well, I mean, you can certainly, basically you can think of let me go back. So here, this overlap, you can think of being like a readout that kind of, you can think of like a
okay,
linear.
right, that's exactly that, isn't it?
And yes, you can.
Right, because that is a linear.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a feeling, maybe I'm wrong, but I have a feeling that this overlap will kind of, if you just look at the overlap, you will kind of just look at, you will have the same capacity between a chaotic attractor and a fixed point attractor. And my guess would be that you increase capacity by exploiting the temporal structure of a chaotic attractor, maybe. And so in that case, the overlap maybe at some point will no more be stationary, and just the pattern of projection with the different patterns will be. I don't know.
I think you're right about exploiting the temporal structure as a possible explanation for what you have the increased capacity. Though the mean field theory that we use, we are assuming that the overlaps actually are constant in the large N limit. to compute the capacity, and that seems to give a very accurate. So it gives a good description of what we see in the simulations. Though of course, so what you see here, in other words, I think are consistent with finite size effects, kind of these fluctuations.
So I have a question. Like since you mentioned finite size effects, I think it would be interesting to see whether you can develop the theory beyond the mean field. So here you talk a lot about the attractor state. I'm wondering, did you think about like when they transit between different attractor states on the boundary on the phase diagram? Did you find any critical phenomena just similar to what people see in the spin system?
Yeah, very good question. We haven't really explored these questions very systematically. So yes, so we have, I mean, when we are close to the maximal capacity, we have evidence that basically the system has. So Ulysses looked, for example, at what the distribution of times spent in a particular attractor before it kind of goes away, and it's consistent with an exponential distribution basically. So it's kind of consistent with the idea that these chaotic fluctuations is really like you can think about it as noise in a potential well, and then at some point you escape from that well when the barrier is not very large anymore, which is what happens when you're close to capacity. But we haven't really studied, apart from these observations, we really haven't studied these effects systematically.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Nicolas? Alrighty, I think we can wrap up here for today. I'd like to thank our speaker, Nicolas, again, and everyone for the participation. So we will resume next week, and hopefully I will see everyone there. Have a nice day, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice talk, Nicolas.
Thanks all. Hope to see you in person in the near future. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.